Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. Welcome to our wonderful, newly refurbished speech room. Welcome to the Hill. And welcome to this, our third Harrow Giant Talk, a Harrow Association initiative born during our 450 celebrations in 2022 and now a firm annual event in the Harrow calendar. Tonight's talk, the third in this sequence, is the brainchild of Julia Walton, who is doing her best to be disguised there at the back. She's waving now. Good. Curator of the Old Speech Room Gallery, the OSRG as we know it here locally. Thank you, Julia, and also to Joe Payne for your enthusiasm and organisation with respect to this evening and all things to do with the focus of tonight's talk. It's terrific to have so many people here, and in particular a welcome to the trustees from the Keats-Shelley Association, and thank you for your generous support of the evening overall. It's lovely to see friends of Harrow and their guests, old Harrovians and their guests too, and not just a few beaks and boys from the school. Now, Harrow has an interesting relationship with its old boys, and I'm not talking to the ones who are still breathing in the room. The most famous of them, of course, we elevate into this wonderful title, Giants of Old. It approaches nearly a cultish level of veneration that we have for them. There are songs about them. There are galleries for them. There are busts of them. There are oil paintings of them. Some of them, unwittingly, become honorary patrons, benevolent ghosts, lending their service and achievement from former years to the endeavours of today. When it's work in the community, it's Shaftesbury. When it's leadership, it's Churchill. When it's the natural world, it's Joseph Banks. I sometimes reflect on what they would think about being borrowed in this way. And tonight, especially, what Byron would think about us being gathered like this, together, perhaps inwardly deeply moved and affected, whilst outwardly protesting eloquently. Given the legend that he once attempted to blow up his headmaster on the speech room stage, I shouldn't perhaps provoke his spirit any further and turn tonight to our speaker. A heartfelt welcome back to Harrow to Peter Hunter. Peter is, in his own right, a giant of the school, dedicating over 33 years to Harrow. A beak from 1985 to 2018 and housemaster of the park from 2001 to 2013. Peter is a gentleman, a scholar, and an educationalist. As I took my first faltering steps here as deputy headmaster 12 years ago, I would not have been able to progress at all without his very carefully crafted counsel, always informing and never offending. He was the last beak to be the Vaughan librarian, overseeing the significant refurbishment of the library in the 1990s. This was then the place where Peter's interest in Byron was ignited. He had been chairman of the OSRG Treasures Committee during his time and did, in that role, catalogue Harrow's Byron collection, no mean feat in itself. Sometime chairman of the British Byron Society, Peter is now widely and justifiably viewed as a true Byron scholar and one of our own. And I can't think of anyone more fitting to deliver tonight's talk. Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Headmaster, for your very kind words of welcome. Could you raise a hand if you can't hear me very clearly? That's fantastic. And thank you also to the friends and colleagues, trustees, old Harrovians who've turned up tonight, particularly some of my old pupils, one or two of whom I think still owe me some preps. I look forward to seeing you afterwards. And so welcome all to the hill, or Mount Ida, Ida, blessed spot, as Byron called it. We're going to begin with Ralph and Mark performing 2 verses of a song about Byron and his Harrow contemporary, Robert Peel, who gazes down at us from a portrait to my left. Ralph and Mark. Thank you very much. That's a lovely song, Edward Bowen's 1884 song about the dreamer Byron and the doer Robert Peel. I can see what Bowen is trying to do with this song. It's summed up in a line in the last verse, "None so narrow, the range of Harrow." And what he's doing is he's celebrating the variety of Harrovians who have been nurtured on the hill. It's a sentiment which holds good today. There's no Harrovian stereotype, such as the crude caricature of the man who sits in the chair that's been fetched by the Wycomist. Well, you know the rest. I don't want to take too sharp a scalpel to a charming song, but I'd question the over-neat dichotomy in the song between the doer and the dreamer. Peel is called a doer because he fed the poor. Byron is a dreamer, but his achievement, praised in the same verse, is for his death, dying for freedom far away. Dying for freedom was not a dream for Byron. Laying down his life for his friends was the noblest episode in his short, sinful, highly charged life. It was heroic. How did he end up? Dying during a thunderstorm in Messalongi exactly 200 years ago tonight, aged only 36. What part did Harrow play in nurturing him? And why does he belong in the Harrow pantheon of giants? What do we make of him 200 years on, with all his notoriety? After all, he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know, as Caroline Lamb so famously claimed. An embarrassment in Britain, a god in Greece. That was the headline in last Saturday's Telegraph. So let's start by looking at his family. Byron was a man highly aware of his ancestry. Who were the Byrons? A Norman family. They'd been given the abbey and lands of Newstead in Nottinghamshire by Henry VIII. The barony was granted by Charles I. And owing to the rules of male primogeniture, a 10-year-old schoolboy, George Gordon Byron, in Aberdeen, found himself the owner of Newstead Abbey and the 6th Baron in 1798. Byron's romantic imagination ran riot with his ancestral home, even though, perhaps because, it was in a dilapidated condition.
Newstead, what saddening change of scene is thine? Thy yawning arch betokens slow decay. The last and youngest of a noble line now holds thy mouldering turrets in his sway.
Ironic prescience, he was the last of the line to live there. For him, the Gothic demonstration of his romantic sensibility already preferred the picturesque ruins to the well-ordered country house and agricultural estate. Having sworn for years he would never part with Newstead, he later sold it to his Harrow friend, Thomas Wildman, whose name is carved beneath his on the walls of the fourth form room. Wildman was ADC to Lord Uxbridge at Waterloo, he of "Good God, sir, I've lost my leg" fame. In his youth, Byron used to hold court at Newstead, using the Great Hall as a shooting gallery, dressing up in monk's robes, drinking toasts out of a cup mounted in silver, made out of the skull of a jolly friar or monk of the abbey, as he put it, dug up in the grounds. This is not the cup. Mrs. Wildman was horrified to find such an object after she moved into Newstead and it was given a Christian burial in a secret location. The photo behind me is of a fake which was offered to Harrow School in 2020 by a dealer for £10,000. It's a very good fake. Here's another fake, which has been in the Harrow collection since 1898. It's a copy of the Pharsalia of Lucan given by one of the Drury family. And inside what they thought was an inscription in Byron's handwriting. It is, however, a forgery by George Gordon de Luna Byron, alias de Gibbler, who claimed to be the poet's illegitimate son. It's rather fun to have a genuine forgery. It's not just stamps that get faked. On his mother's side, he was a Scot. Catherine Gordon was the Laird of Gecht in Aberdeenshire. It was her wealth alone, £30,000, about 3 or 4 million in today's money, which, alas, made her attractive to Byron's father, Mad Jack, whom she met in Bath, and who already had a daughter, Augusta, by a previous marriage. Here's Gecht today, totally ruined. The history of the Gordons is the tale of murders, assassinations, executions, and poisonings, and even drowning in the notorious Black Pool in the River Ithon below the walls of the castle, the Hagbury Pot. It may look calm to you, but the devil has been known to consort in its depths. Aberdeen locals made up a ballad to mock the marriage, which was to ruin her fortune. Where are ye gaen, bonny Miss Gordon? Where are ye gaen, sae bonny and braw? You've married wi' mad Johnny Byron to squander the lands o' Gecht awa. Harrow owns this little ivory cup which Mrs. Byron gave to young George on his 8th birthday. And this estate, too, was sold, this time to a neighbour, to pay for Johnny's debts. Now, you might think this was Byron. It has a Byronic look about it. It's his distant cousin, also called George Gordon, a fellow Harrovian, the 4th Earl of Aberdeen, later Prime Minister, on whose Harrow House estate Gecht still lies. Byron revelled in the romance of his Aberdeenshire ancestry. I'm half a Scot by birth and bred a whole one, he claimed. And he sees himself in his poem Lachan na Gair as a young Highland chieftain, striding the mountains of what is now the Balmoral estate, though he was there 50 years before Queen Victoria. Lachan na Gair, or Loch na Gar, is not a loch, it's a mountain.
Ah, there my young footsteps in infancy wandered. My cap was the bonnet, my cloak was the plaid. On chieftains long perished my memory pondered, as daily I strove through the pine-covered glade.
Now, this word chieftain I'm going to come back to later. But on inheriting, Byron and his mother left Aberdeen and went south. He never returned. In a moment of great generosity, examples of which we can see all through his life, he gave away his gold pocket watch to his namesake in Aberdeen, George Byron Melvin, the son of his nurse. It's now in the Harrow School collection. This is the reverse, showing the family coat of arms and the motto, Crede Byron. He came to Harrow in April 1801. And this is the earliest known image of Harrovians, 1795. And you can see them wearing the garment from which the modern tailcoat derives, though in Byron's day there was more scope for colour. Byron once ordered a coat of superfine olive cloth in dark green, and then the old speech room wing would be added 25 years later. He came with some disadvantages. The only son of a widowed mother with a regional accent after 10 years in Aberdeen. "Dinna speak of it," he retorted, and raised his whip to someone who asked him about his deformed foot, perhaps a club foot. He hated Harrow at first, where he was bullied. He woke up one morning to find someone had put his foot into a bucket of cold water. In this, the first image of Byron by William Kay, he's 10 years old, and you can see that his foot is rather cleverly disguised behind a clump of ferns. He was adrift.
"There goes Byron, straggling up the hill like a ship in storm, without rudder or compass."
Thus commented Mrs. Drury, wife of the headmaster, Dr. Joseph Drury, looking out of the windows of number 1. This is his memorial in St. Mary's. Byron, by the way, was how he was called at Harrow. Even Peel, until he died in 1850, referred to him as Byron. How else was Harrow a difficult environment for him? "I always hated Harrow," he said, "until the last year and a half." If a letter to his lawyer, John Hanson, is to be believed, it was a pretty squalid place. He was about to stay with Hanson for the holidays and wrote, "Only do exterminate that vile generation of bugs which nearly ate me up last time I sojourned at your house. But after undergoing the purgatory of Harrow board and lodgings for 3 months, I shall not be particular in my demands." The first tutor was Henry Drury, the headmaster's son, who in the song enters all in a fury. Drury wrote of Byron's inattention to business and poor behaviour. He must have been a handful. He changed what we now call housemasters 3 times. When Tom Moore asked Dr. Drury for a recollection of the poet, the headmaster reminisced rosily about the shy mountain colt whom he'd had to lead by a silken string. But Byron's animal spirits and want of judgment led to the headmaster suggesting that he leave at Christmas 1804 and get a private tutor. Byron ignored him. His passionate awareness of his honour was roused when Henry Drury reprimanded him for the heinous crime of talking in church. The boys at that time worshipped at St. Mary's. "I'm sorry to say," he wrote to his mother, "that Mr. Henry Drury has behaved himself to me in a manner I neither can nor will bear." Having described him as a blackguard, Drury threatened to have him expelled. "Is this usage for anybody? Had I stole or behaved in a most abominable way to him, his language could not have been more outrageous. Better let him take away my life than ruin my character. If I'm treated in this manner, I will not stay at this school." Interesting letter for a 15-year-old, something of an adolescent tantrum perhaps, but this curious insistence on his reputation, his character, and yet 13 years later, his reputation in tatters. He'd leave England forever. Byron might well have been talking in church. His attention did wander, such as when he took the trouble to write his name on the panel beside his seat. It's just there, halfway down, quite near the bottom. It's also worth noting that the exiled Byron in 1822, grieving the death of his 6-year-old daughter Allegra, not only had her body shipped back from Italy for burial at Harrow, but more interestingly requested that the funeral be taken by Henry Drury. It's an extraordinary gesture by any old Harrovian to have such a nostalgic love for his old school. But his reputation was sullied, and the vicar of St. Mary's refused to allow the burial of the 6-year-old girl, as Byron had requested. This is her memorial, which you all know outside the church porch. Drury was not the only source of Byron's adolescent frustrations. Many letters to his half-sister Augusta show him complaining bitterly about his mother. "She flies into a fit of frenzy. Am I to be goaded with insult, loaded with obloquy, suffer my feelings to be outraged on the most trivial occasions? Mrs. Byron Furioso. My maternal persecutor will be throwing her tomahawk at all my projects. My amiable mamma." As he writes of the mother of one of his literary heroes, Don Juan, some women use their tongues. She looked a lecture. For Byron, relationships were paramount and passionate, both with girls and with boys. On girls first, Byron refused to return to Harrow for the start of the autumn term 1803. His mother explains in a letter held in our archives.
You may not be surprised, and so may Dr. Drury, that Byron is not returned to Harrow. I have done all in my power for 6 weeks past. He has no indisposition that I know of, but love, desperate love, the worst of all maladies, in my opinion.
He had fallen in love with his neighbour's daughter, Mary Charth. It was a hopeless case. He was 15, she was 18, and engaged. Her reported or overheard comment, "Do you think I could care anything for that lame boy?" must have had a devastating effect on his self-worth. Was Cathy's rejection of Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff himself a Byronic hero, inspired by this alleged event? And so you often see him trying to prove himself in the years following, boasting about making 18 runs in the Eton-Harrow cricket match. The scorebook claims he made 9. That would be an example. Or his boxing with the famous pugilist Gentleman Jackson, whose descendant is sitting here this evening, but she's not a pugilist. As would swimming across the Hellespont, a considerable achievement. And boys, my school friendships were with me passions. That with Lord Clare being one of the earliest and lasted longest. I never hear the word Clare without the beating of the heart. By an amazing coincidence, Byron met the Earl of Clare, John Fitzgibbon, years later in 1821 on a road between Imola and Bologna. This meeting annihilated for a moment all the years between the present time and the days at Harrow. We were but 5 minutes together, but I hardly recollect an hour of my existence which could be weighed against them. That's an amazing claim. But what about this word chieftain that I've left dangling in front of you? Clare was one of a group of boys whom Byron confessed he spoilt by indulgence. Byron saw himself, he placed himself as the leader of a little gang. He called them his Theban band. And in this we see the embryo of the private army he was to raise and pay for in Greece in 1824. Byron became a poet at Harrow. Yes, he did slip away to the Peachy Stone and lie there for hours composing his verses. In Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, he notes, "I abhorred too much to conquer for the poet's sake the drilled dull lesson, forced down word for word in my repugnant youth." And you recall the song, "Hid from lesson and game away."
Again I behold where for hours I have pondered, as reclining at eve on yon tombstone I lay, or round the steep brow of the churchyard I wandered, to catch the last gleam of the sun's setting ray.
It was here at the Peachy Stone that Byron spent part of his last evening as a Harrovian, in the company of John Claridge, another of the band. Byron gave Claridge a present of 5 sumptuous volumes of the Arabian Nights, and Claridge gave them back to the Monitor's Library later. They're still here today. My first Harrow verses, Byron wrote, a translation from the Prometheus of Aeschylus, were received by Dr. Drury, but coolly. Here's 4 lines.
Great Jove, to whose almighty throne both gods and mortals homage pay, ne'er may my soul thy powers disown, thy dread behests ne'er disobey.
In later years, Byron mocked such verses, as often we find him reassessing the follies of his past. His relationship with Henry Drury recovered after the St. Mary's episode, and he sent him the following lines from Constantinople during his Mediterranean travels of 1809, written on top of the Symplegades, the clashing rocks, famous from Jason and the Argonauts.
Oh, how I wish that an embargo had kept in port the good ship Argo, who, still on loan from Grecian docks, had never passed the azure rocks. But now I fear her trip will be a damned business for my Miss Medea.
What's revealing in his letters to Drury is Byron's self-awareness. For example, he writes several letters to friends boasting about swimming the Hellespont. It showed courage. That lame foot, which held him back so often, was not going to stop him achieving this impressive physical feat. And he knew from his classics that Leander died in the swimming. But it's to Drury that he acknowledges himself as trumpeting it. He knows that he can only be honest about his pride to the Harrow beak who understood all his foibles. Sometimes Byron's swagger is rather endearing. In a letter to John Polidori, he boasts, "There are three things I can do that you can't. I can swim across that river, I can snuff out that candle at the distance of 20 paces with a gun, and I've written a poem of which 14,000 copies were sold in one day." His love of Greece seems to be nurtured about this time as he reached the plain of Marathon, and he was overwhelmed with historic reverberations. This is where the Greeks had beaten the Persians in 490 BC, and in Don Juan he writes,
"The mountains look on Marathon, and Marathon looks on the sea. And musing there an hour alone, I dreamed that Greece might still be free."
Dying for freedom, far away went the song. Where did this love of Greece come from? The key is the word freedom. Byron would die in the cause of freedom against foreign oppression. Dr. Butler became the new headmaster for Byron's last term at school. With his already pretty cocky attitude towards authority, Byron, now a monitor, amused himself and his mates by lampooning him. In this extract, Dr. Butler is pomposus. You is the school.
"Of narrow brain, yet of narrower soul, Pomposus holds you in his harsh control, with noisy nonsense and newfangled rules, such as were ne'er before enforced in schools."
So once again, Byron matured to reflect on what must have been at least a somewhat embarrassing episode for the headmaster. "I gave him cause for offence," he later wrote. "I acted like the turbulent schoolboy committing the pranks of a tyro." Byron did see the error of his ways and apologized, and Butler even gave him a gold pen with which he wrote his first letters about Greece. So the visit to Marathon took place during his tour 1809 to 1811. And here he is in Sanders' amazing picture of him on the eve of his departure. The jacket and the scarf blown back in a sort of swagger, and his page, Robert Rushton, gazing up at him with adoration. As he reaches Lisbon, you can feel the new freedoms arising in his sinews. "I'm very happy here because I loves oranges and talk bad Latin to the monks. And I goes into society and I swims in the Tagus and I swears Portuguese and I've got diarrhea and bites from mosquitoes, but what of that? Comfort must not be expected by folks that go a-pleasuring." Travelling through Albania, he was welcomed at the court of Ali Pasha. One of the strongest impressions ever made on Byron was by Pasha's magnificent warriors, with, as he put it, their long white kilt, you recall him striding over Loch Nagar, gold-worked cloak, crimson velvet, gold-laced jacket, waistcoat, silver-mounted pistols, and daggers. He couldn't resist acquiring his own.
The wild Albanian, kirtled to his knee with shawl-girt head and ornamented gun, and gold-embroidered garments fair to see, the crimson-scarfed men of Macedon.
This one cost him the equivalent of £5,000. This image of Byron, painted by Thomas Phillips, is the one which has contributed most to his legendary status as a military and romantic hero. Ali Pasha rather overestimated the diplomatic importance of Byron, his admiration of his British guest having its fantastic side. He caressed Byron's earlobes and sent him almonds and sugared sherbet. At the same time, he was a notorious despot who impaled and roasted his enemies, amongst other unspeakable cruelties. And here you see him in the background, there's some wretch being dragged off to be impaled and roasted. One of the challenges of managing a Byron collection is establishing the truth about the objects. We rejected the offer of the fake skull, and then there was the De Gibbler forgery. This interesting Turkish yatagan was presented to Harrow in 1895. It has a label on it declaring it had belonged to Byron at Messalongi and was used against Ali Pasha. Well, I don't know if Byron objected strongly to his earlobes being caressed, but he never took up a dagger against Ali Pasha. Anyway, he met Pasha in 1809 and wasn't in Missolonghi for 14 years after. Ali Pasha came to a sticky end. His severed head briefly landed up on the dinner table in front of the Archbishop of Ioannina before being taken to Constantinople, where it was displayed on a revolving platter. Tyrants of the world, take heed. Byron's travels at this point took him to Greece. His letters vividly convey the dangers of the voyage. He was in the company of his valet, William Fletcher. In a storm off Corfu, Fletcher yelled after his wife, the Greeks called on all the saints, the Mussulman on Allah, the captain burst into tears and ran below telling us to call on God. The sails were split, the main yard shivered, the wind blowing fresh, the night settling in. I wrapped myself in my Albanian cloak and lay down on deck to await the worst. I've learnt to philosophize on my travels. Complaint was useless. His letters are a delight to read today. Athens at this time was under the control of Turkish governors appointed from Constantinople. Byron's feelings of sympathy for the Greek cause were nurtured here. He wrote, "Greece has always been for me the promised end of valor, of the arts, and of liberty throughout all the ages." And even in 1809, he saw there was only one possible course of honorable action. Hereditary bondsmen, know you not who would be free? Themselves must strike the blow. As controversy continues to rage about the proper home for the Parthenon marbles, we can go back to Byron to find out what he thought about their removal. Can you guess what his reaction was? He was outraged by the mutilation, and he did not spare his fellow Scot and fellow Harrovian for his part in the destruction when demanding who the main culprit was.
But who of all the plunderers of yon fane on high, where Pallas lingered, loath to flee the latest relic of her ancient reign, the last, the worst, dull spoiler, who was he? Blush, Caledonia, such thy son could be. England, I joy no child he was of thine. Thy freeborn men should spare what once was free. Yet they could violate such saddening shrine, and bear these altars o'er the long reluctant brine.
And over the brine they came. So for Byron, Lord Elgin's crime was in not showing the respect for a building which represented freedom, and for exploiting the chance he had to take the marbles or the brine from those temporary occupiers who were happy to collude in what he called their dastardly devastation. Mind you, his respect for Greek antiquity did not prevent his scratching Byron into the pillar of the temple at Sunium. After all, we know where he'd learnt his carving techniques. He returned to London, where I awoke one morning and found myself famous. This followed the publication of the first cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. What followed was Byromania. Caroline Lamb identified Byron with the hero of his poem.
Yet oft times, in his maddest, mirthful mood, strange pangs would flash along Childe Harold's brow, as if the memory of some deadly feud or disappointed passion lurked below. But this none knew. And thus, untaught in youth my heart to tame, my springs of life were poisoned.
It's to these London years that Lady Caroline Lamb's famous epithet can be traced: mad, bad, and dangerous to know. His short-lived passion for Caroline, this miniature is in the old speech room gallery, already married to William Lamb, later Queen Victoria's first Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, was the talk of 1812, a year he later referred to as his reign. Women went stark mad over Childe Harold. This frantic attention helped him as he tried to repress his homosexual instincts, which had been given free rein during the Mediterranean tour. But Caroline was too much for him. "Your heart," he wrote to her, "what a little volcano that pours lava through your veins." Elsewhere, he referred to her mania. She was a bullying rattlesnake. During these years, he was lionized by society and became what we would now call a celebrity. Nobody in Europe, except Napoleon, became as famous or infamous. There was riotous living. We clareted and champagned till 2, then supped, and finished with a kind of Regency punch, composed of Madeira, brandy, and green tea. No real water. There was a night for you. After seeing Mrs. Anne Wilmot at a party in a dark evening dress decorated with spangles, he returned to his rooms in Albany, ordered a glass of brandy from Fletcher, and composed one of the loveliest verses of the Romantic period.
She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes. Thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies.
His philosophy is neatly summed up in this couplet.
Let us have wine and women, mirth and laughter, sermons and soda water the day after.
But there was a seriousness of purpose too, and that love of freedom was shown in speeches he gave in the House of Lords. The contradiction of Byron is seen in his appearances here, speaking as a poet rather than as a politician, let alone as an aristocrat, in support of the Nottingham stocking weavers, the frame breakers, up against the arrival of exploitative mechanization. And his second speech, the Protestant with Scottish Presbyterian roots, supporting Catholic emancipation, fighting for freedom again. As he later proclaimed in Don Juan, I was born for opposition. His marriage was a disaster and should never have taken place. Aged 20, he wrote how he did not think he had a bad heart, but it has become so bent, twisted, and trampled on that it is now as hard as a Highlander's heel piece. Looking ahead, he bitterly speculates that owing to his debts, he will end up marrying a golden dolly, i.e. for her money, as his father did, or blow his brains out, both remedies being for him alike. And as we consider Byron's disastrous marriage to Annabella Milbank, we see him at his most reprehensible. This charming miniature in Harrow shows her with her rosy apple cheeks. He wrote to Lady Melbourne, a wife, you say, would be my salvation. I have no heart to spare and expect none in return. I've seen enough of love matches. It was a bizarre courtship. She thought she could reform him. He wrote of her as the most prudish and correct person he knew. I can't tell whether we are to be happy or not. The princess of parallelograms, he called her, praising rather sardonically her mathematical skills. But he never really admired clever wives. But, O ye lords of ladies intellectual, inform us truly, have they not henpecked you all? They married at Seaham, her parents' cliff-top house in County Durham, in the drawing room, kneeling on a cushion, he said, stuffed with peach stones. Hardly auspicious. Ironically, the drawing room today is now a popular wedding venue. Byron's memoirs, which were notoriously burnt in the grate at 50 Albemarle Street, his publisher John Murray's offices, had been read by Samuel Rogers, who recalled the passage where Byron describes his wedding night and waking from his first sleep. The candle was casting a ruddy glare through the crimson curtains of the bed. Good God, he cried in a voice loud enough to waken his wife, I am surely in hell. Yet even on their honeymoon, or treacle moon, as he called it, he vented his spleen. It must come to a separation. It was also about this time that he wrote the poem which is the most frequently anthologized of all his works.
The Assyrian came down like the wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea, when the blue wave rose nightly on deep Galilee.
In the third stanza, he describes the rider thrown from his horse, and in this image we see perhaps Byron lamenting the fall of himself, facing his own destruction, a victim of his own hubris. This is the beach at Seaham, below Annabel's parents' house, where he paced up and down fretfully and nervously during his stay for the wedding in the winter of January 1805, and which is the emotional locus of the Assyrian poem. The second stanza had described the warrior's horse dying on the shore. The foam of his gasping lay white on the turf and cold as the spray on the rock-beating surf. Byron shows a rosier view of men and women's relationships in the sunnier conditions of the Mediterranean. What men call gallantry and gods adultery is much more common where the climate's sultry. And from the same pen came the comment on the English winter, ending in July, to recommence in August. Even when these witty rhyming couplets are so finely employed, there's an attitude to women which explains why some of his works were forbidden to young ladies. A little still she strove, and much repented, and whispering, I will ne'er consent, consented. During this time, Lady Byron later claimed he'd hinted at atrocious crimes he'd committed in the past. Taking his new wife to visit his half-sister Augusta, a parcel arrived from London with a pair of gold brooches, one marked with B and one with A. The A was not for Annabella, it was for Augusta. And the cross symbol, also part of the brooch, was a sign of their illicit relationship. The kind of feeling, he wrote to Lady Melbourne, which has a mixture of the terrible, which renders all other insipid to a degree. Annabella had him medically examined by her doctor, Francis Leman, who diagnosed too much alcohol, not the madness which Annabella suspected. Byron, perhaps thankful that he was not insane, gave Dr. Leman this engraved miniature by his favorite artist, James Holmes, which was then given to Harrow School by Dr. Leman's daughter. Rather amazingly, Lady Byron was photographed in her old age. Here she is. She used to come to worship at St. Mary's Church. Fiona McCarthy, in her biography, explains how Byron was predatory towards his female servants, as was standard practice amongst noblemen and landowners of his age. He treated them with irresponsibility. Here's a copy of the Caledonian Mercury, dated Edinburgh, 14th December 1816. Right at the top is an advertisement for The Prisoner of Chillon, Byron's new poems, just newly arrived in Edinburgh by post. And at the bottom is a list of Stirlingshire landowners who'd acquired game duty certificates. Right at the bottom, possibly difficult to read, Colonel Francis Simpson of Pleen, who I discovered meets Fiona McCarthy's description treating his servant girls with a droit de seigneur, though he redeemed himself partly by leaving his fortune to found an old people's home, which thrives today outside Stirling, I'm pleased to say, though I might personally regret that his wealth is not today enjoyed by his five great-grandson. Byron's last complete poem was The Island, which deals with the mutiny on the Bounty. And here's Captain Bligh and his men being cast adrift on their boat while the mutineers wave them goodbye from under the shade of the breadfruit plants. Another Byronic chieftain. Francis Simpson's son-in-law, my four-greats-uncle, Peter Hayward, can't be seen on the, near the breadfruit plants or in the boat. He was later sentenced to hang for his part in the mutiny. But he got off with a rather amazing excuse. He said he was down below packing his bags, but got detained. Otherwise, he would have joined his captain on the boat. Byron's conquests and liaisons during these London years far outnumber those of Simpson of Pleen. And so, in 1816, he leaves England forever, too many scandals raising their ugly heads. The notorious skull cup, which I mentioned, is seen as part of his baggage in this cartoon, but in fact, it's just resting on the edge of the boat in front of all the bottles. In fact, I said it was left behind at Newstead, and you can see Lady Byron waving from the white cliffs of Dover in the background. On the way through Europe, he stopped at the battlefield of Waterloo, where his erstwhile hero, Napoleon, had met his match in Wellington.
Stop, for thy tread is on an empire's dust.
The Duchess of Richmond held a ball on the eve of the battle.
There was a sound of revelry by night, and Belgium's capital had gathered then her beauty and her chivalry. and bright the lamps shone over fair women and brave men. 1,000 hearts beat happily, and when music arose with its voluptuous swell, soft eye looked love to eyes which spake again. And all went merry as a marriage bell. But hush, hark, a deep sound strikes like a rising knell. Did ye not hear it? No, 'twas but the wind, or the car rattling o'er the stony street. On with the dance, let joy be unconfined, no sleep till morn, when youth and pleasure meet to chase the glowing hours with flying feet. But hark, that heavy sound breaks in once more, as if the clouds its echo would repeat. And nearer, clearer, deadlier than before. Arm, arm, it is, the cannon's opening roar.
As he describes the Battle of Waterloo, he recalls the advance of the Camerons. The chief, Lochiel, was a Harrovian.
How in the noon of night that pibroch thrills, savage and shrill.
For Byron, the fall of Napoleon was a great blow. He'd fought at Harrow to have a statue of the French leader in his room. In Napoleon, Byron admired a man of action who proved there was an alternative to the inertia and folly he observed in English political life. A king who can't, a Prince of Wales who won't, patriots who shan't, ministers who don't. Harrow's copy of the Ode to Napoleon is one of the outstanding objects in the Old Speech Room Gallery, and it's remarkable because it contains 4 versions of the poem, each amended and annotated by Byron himself. And here in this ode you can find Byron's ambivalence towards Napoleon, admiration and disgust commingled.
And earth has spilt her blood for him, who thus can hold his own. And monarchs bowed the trembling limb, and thanked him for a throne. Fair freedom, may we hold thee dear, when this thy mightiest foe their fear in humblest kind have shown. O ne'er my tyrant leave behind a brighter name to lure mankind.
From around 1821, Byron signed letters and adopted the monogram N.B. Napoleon Bonaparte? No. Noel Byron. By the terms of his marriage to Annabella Milbank, whom he hadn't seen since 1816, he was now entitled to a share of the Noel estate, which she inherited, and for which she changed her name to Noel. Here's an object from the Old Speech Room Gallery, and you can see NB and the coronet. His years in Italy were a calm before the storm of Greece. Harrow owns this curious object. Byron loved shooting. We own a couple of his guns, and this is a Tuscan silver coin into which Byron fired a lead ball at 25 yards range in the garden of his villa in Pisa. If you turn it over, you can see the ball embedded in the coin. Byron's stay in Genoa in 1822 was a crucial time in his life. It was here he made the decision to go to Greece, actually to go there and support the cause and not just make a financial contribution. It was now and here that he developed a sense of higher purpose. One of his friends was Douglas Kinnaird, who once owned this portrait of Byron by William West, which now hangs in the Old Speech Room Gallery. In a letter to Kinnaird from Genoa, he confides he was anxious to leave his family more than a mere name and to be able to do good to others. What could be more simply put? It's shocking to see how he deteriorated physically in a very short space of time. In this sketch, also in the Harrow collection by D'Orsay, we see him only 2 years after that last portrait, and he looks an old man, leaning on his stick. He was suffering from loose teeth, his hair was going grey, yet he was in his early 30s. Was his rakish lifestyle now catching up, and did intimations of mortality sharpen his mind? I think it was here that Byron chose to write the final chapter of what would be his legacy. Greece was the only place I was ever contented in, he wrote. It is not that I could pretend to anything in a military capacity. I might be of use. At any rate, I would try. There had been a sympathetic response to the outrageous massacre at Chios in 1822 when 25,000 Greeks were slaughtered by the Turks. In England, the Tory government was reluctant to support the Greeks, worried that if the Turks were defeated, the Russians would move in. Byron's election as a member of the London Greek Committee must have been some reassurance to him, representing rehabilitation, gratitude, acceptance back in England. Lady Blessington noted that he needed to prove that a poet may be a soldier. He began selling his furniture, his books, watches, trinkets, anything of value which could be put towards the war effort. And because he's Byron, he needs the kit. So he commissioned a helmet from Giacomo Aspe. Facing the prospect of death, he remarked, "I hope it may be an action, for that would be a good finish to a very triste existence." His heart was wrung by the plight of Greek refugees whom he encountered at Ithaca. Immediately, he handed over $250 Spanish for their relief and organized weekly allowances for some of the widows and orphans. "By that God who made me for my own misery and not much for the good of others," he wrote. But generosity was in his character. Towards the end of 1823, he was now offering a loan of £4,000 to the Greeks to pay wages in their navy. It's about $500,000 in today's currency. And then there were those Suliot warriors whose fabulous costume he'd so admired and which he'd been painted by Thomas Phillips. He offered to pay for 500 of them himself. 600 of them turned up, with their wives, with their families, with their animals to support. The Theban band he'd led on the hill was now a private and very expensive army. And so to Messalongi, a town beside a lagoon and built on a marshy plain. This rather fanciful picture shows him being greeted by Prince Alexander Mavrocordatos, who represented Byron with a ceremonial saber, which you can see today at Harrow. Messalongi was a wretched place. The stink, the vapor, the bad air made it pestilential, wrote Henry Fox. The swamps bred malarial mosquitoes. "If we're not taken off by the sword, we are like to march off with an ague, a fever, in this mud basket," Byron writes. And in this letter, you can see in the very last line 2 words underlined, and there's a pun there if you look out for it. He suggests that they might not die martially, but martially, not as soldiers, but in the swamp. Amazing sense of humor at a very difficult time. Harrow owns 6 letters from his last few weeks in Greece, which reveal his endless frustrations and difficulties with the Greek factions in whose cause his life's blood was gradually and literally being spent. "I do not grudge any expense for the cause," he writes, "but I caught cold yesterday, swearing too much in the rain at the Greeks, who would not bear a hand in landing the stores." These had arrived from London. Byron shamed them by rolling up his sleeves and doing it himself. "I was a fool to come here," he wrote, "but being here, I must see what is to be done." And much of his funds were spent relieving sufferings of both Greeks and Turks. The boy who gave away his gold watch was now dispensing his fortune. The sadness is that Byron found himself embroiled in the internal factions of the various groups within the Greek camp. As Roderick Beaton puts it, it was a conflict between rival liberators. The tensions took their toll. His mood oscillated between optimism and disillusionment. He was drinking too much and taking pills to reduce his weight, purgatives washed down with Epsom salts. He was susceptible to fits. What sort of fits? Whether epileptic, paralytic, apoplectic is not yet decided, he wrote. In a state of advanced physical weakness, Byron was caught in a downpour whilst riding and developed fever and severe muscular pains. The medical treatment did more to harm than heal. Bloodletting was thought to be effective, and this was achieved by placing leeches on his temples. It's been calculated that about 2.5 litres of blood were removed by his doctors in the last couple of days of his life. After his death, during a thunderstorm on the 18th of April, 1824, his faithful valet, William Fletcher, cut off a lock of his hair. Today, it rests in the Harrow collection. What was he doing then in Greece as we summarize his achievement? He was a representative of the London Committee and entrusted to disperse their funds. No doubt he was hoping to rehabilitate his reputation in the eyes of the British public. Second, he thought he might resolve some of his personal problems. The 11 years since his reign in London had taken their toll. Was he trying to dispel the disillusion of middle age and recover something he perhaps knew he could never find again? But most importantly, he believed in the justice of the Greek cause and believed that they should be independent. This survived all the dishonesty and the laziness and the interfighting which made the whole venture so frustrating. Like little Allegra, only 3 years earlier, he was shipped home, though his lungs and larynx were removed and kept in Missolonghi, though later lost. He was buried in the family vault in Hucknall near Newstead Abbey, and you might have thought that having been laid to rest, he would now be left to that peace after such a life of turmoil. But it was not to be. The Byron vault was opened on the night of 15th June 1938, with all those present pledged to secrecy. After midnight, the vicar went back on his own and descended into the vault for another look. On top of the coffin, he wrote, there was a coronet. The rim was intact, but the velvet cap and tassel and the 6 pearls had disappeared. Upon closer examination of the coffin, I made the discovery that the lid was loose. On raising the lid slightly, I saw that the leaden cast case within had been cut open. Worried that the body might have been stolen, the vicar gazed at the wooden coffin within the lead casing. Its lid had never been fastened. What was beneath it? Dare I look within? Yes, the world would know the truth. Reverently, very reverently, I raised the lid, and before my eyes lay the embalmed body of Byron in as perfect a condition as when he had been placed there 114 years ago. The serene, almost happy expression on his face made a profound impression on me. But enough. A smaller casket containing his heart and brains stood nearby. God knows I have been guilty of many excesses, Byron wrote. And as we contemplate his life and death 200 years on tonight, we can weigh up his excesses alongside the worldwide reputation he has today as a writer, a poet, and a fighter for freedom, a dreamer and a doer. And here he is in Cambridge, in Athens, Durham, Aberdeen, and at Harrow, where we will leave him up atop of the Peachy Stone.
So we'll go no more, a roving so late into the night, though the heart be still as loving and the moon be still as bright.
For the sword outwears its sheath, and the sword wears out the breast, and the heart must pause to breathe, and love itself have rest.
Though the nights were made for loving, and the day returns too soon, yet we'll go no more a roving by the light of the moon. Thank you for listening.